Throughout my decades studying the human psyche, I discovered something that changed everything about how I understood both psychology and spirituality. Jesus, whether understood as historical figure or archetypal reality, used a specific symbol to describe the structure of the human soul. Not a simple symbol, not a vague metaphor, but a precise, psychologically accurate representation of how the soul is actually structured. And the Church, in its centuries of theological development, largely missed it, or perhaps suppressed it. Because this symbol, when truly understood, reveals that the soul is not the simple, one-dimensional entity Christian doctrine presents. The soul is complex, fourfold, structured as what I came to call the quaternity. And Jesus knew this, demonstrated it, taught it through parables, through his life, through the very structure of the gospel narratives. He used the symbol of four, the cross, the mandala, the complete, integrated wholeness that requires four dimensions to be whole. When I first recognized this pattern, I was studying Christian symbolism alongside my clinical work with patients. And I noticed something striking. The structure of psychological wholeness that I was observing in successful analyses, what I called individuation, matched precisely the structure Jesus used to describe spiritual wholeness. Four dimensions, four aspects, four parts that must be integrated. In psychological terms, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, or consciousness, unconsciousness, persona, shadow, or ego, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, self. Always four, always requiring integration of all four to achieve wholeness. And Jesus, I realized, was teaching the same structure. Four gospels, not three. Four corners of the cross. Four aspects of his ministry. Four types of people in his parables. The symbol appears repeatedly, persistently, insistently. And it is not accidental, it is accurate. It is how the soul is actually structured. And understanding this symbol changes everything about spiritual development. The reason this matters psychologically is profound. Most people live from one function, one dimension. They identify with thinking and reject feeling, or identify with sensation and suppress intuition. They live fractional lives, partial lives, 1/4 of what they could be, and they wonder why they feel incomplete. Why something is missing, why spiritual practices feel empty. It is because they are operating from fragmented consciousness, from one aspect trying to be the whole. And wholeness, what Jesus called the kingdom, what I call individuation, requires all four. Requires integrating what you have rejected, requires developing what you have suppressed, requires becoming complete instead of remaining partial. And the symbol Jesus used, the quaternity, the fourfold structure, shows exactly what wholeness looks like, shows what must be integrated, shows the work that spiritual development actually requires. Today, I'm going to share with you what I discovered about this symbol. The four dimensions Jesus identified, the thinking function he demonstrated through teaching, the feeling function he manifested through compassion, the sensation function he embodied through physical healing, and the intuitive function he accessed through his connection to what he called the Father. These are not religious categories, they are psychological realities. And Jesus, whether consciously or through archetypal wisdom, structured his life and teaching around the complete integration of all four. He was, in psychological terms, what I call the individuated self, the whole human, the complete soul. And he used the symbol of four to show others what wholeness requires. What the soul must integrate, what spiritual development actually demands. This is not theology, this is psychology. This is the structure of the psyche that Jesus understood and that I spent my career rediscovering through clinical observation. Make your choice. Which of the four dimensions speaks to you? Which have you developed? Which have you suppressed? And then stay. Because what I will show you next is not interpretation, it is observation. It is what Jesus actually taught when you look at the structure beneath the doctrines, when you see the psychological truth beneath the theological overlay, when you recognize that the symbol he used, the quaternity, the cross, the fourfold structure, is not just spiritual metaphor. It is an accurate map of how the soul is structured, how consciousness develops, how wholeness is achieved, and why most people living from one dimension experience perpetual incompleteness no matter how much they believe, how much they pray, how devotedly they practice. Because belief is not wholeness, practice is not integration, and until all four dimensions are developed and unified, the soul remains fragmented, remains incomplete, remains far from the kingdom Jesus said is within. The kingdom that is actually psychological wholeness, the complete, integrated soul that the symbol of four accurately describes. Let me begin with the first dimension of the quaternity that Jesus demonstrated, the thinking function. Jesus was, above all, a teacher. His ministry was primarily intellectual engagement, parables that required thought, questions that demanded reflection, teachings that challenged existing frameworks. He did not just perform miracles, he explained, he taught. He engaged the thinking function of his followers and his opponents, and this is the first dimension of the soul, the capacity for rational thought, for logic, for intellectual understanding, for making sense of experience through concepts and frameworks. And when I observed patients who had integrated this function successfully, they possessed clarity. They could articulate their experience. They could think about their psyche instead of just being tossed around by it. This is what Jesus demonstrated as teacher, the thinking function fully developed, used not just for mundane matters, but for spiritual insight, for psychological wisdom, for understanding the structure of the soul itself. But here is what I discovered through my clinical work. Most people either over-identify with thinking or completely suppress it. Those who over-identify become what I call thinking types. They live entirely in their head. They analyze everything. They cannot access feeling or intuition. They try to think their way to wholeness when wholeness requires more than thought. They become like the Pharisees Jesus constantly challenged. People who had elaborate intellectual frameworks but no heart, no compassion, no connection to the deeper dimensions of psyche. They knew scripture intellectually but missed its psychological truth. And Jesus, though he possessed powerful thinking function, did not over-identify with it. He used it. But he also transcended it. He could think deeply and feel deeply, could teach intellectually and heal empathically. This is integration. This is what the symbol of four requires. Not rejecting thinking, but not being limited to thinking either. On the other hand, I observed many patients who had suppressed thinking entirely, what I call feeling types or sensation types, who are anti-intellectual, who distrust rational thought, who pride themselves on going with their gut or following their heart, while dismissing the thinking function as cold, mechanical, soulless. And these people, though they may be emotionally sensitive or physically present, lack the capacity to understand their experience, lack the ability to create frameworks that help them navigate psyche. They are tossed around by emotions they cannot comprehend, driven by sensations they cannot interpret, lost in intuitions they cannot articulate. And they need what Jesus demonstrated. They need to develop thinking function, need to learn to reflect on experience instead of just experiencing, need to cultivate the capacity to teach themselves about their own psyche through thought, through study, through intellectual engagement with depth psychology. Jesus demonstrated thinking function fully integrated with other functions. He could engage the Pharisees intellectually, matching their knowledge of scripture and law. But he could also feel the suffering of the outcast and respond with compassion, could sense when crowds were hungry and provide physical nourishment, could access intuitive knowing of people's inner states without being told. This is wholeness. This is the quaternity functioning as unity, and the teaching he provided, the parables, the sermons, the intellectual frameworks, these were not just content, they were demonstrations. Demonstrations of thinking function used in service of wholeness. Used not to dominate other functions, but to integrate with them, to help people understand what they feel, to give language to what they intuit, to create frameworks for what they sense. This is what the first dimension of the soul requires. Thinking developed, but not dominant, present, but not exclusive, integrated with feeling, sensation, and intuition to create complete consciousness. When I worked with patients on developing thinking function, I taught them to reflect, to journal, to create frameworks for understanding their experience, to read depth psychology, to think about their dreams instead of just having them, to articulate their emotions instead of just feeling them, to understand their sensations instead of just experiencing them. This is what Jesus did through his teaching. He gave people frameworks, concepts, language, ways of thinking about spiritual and psychological realities that help them integrate experience instead of being fragmented by it. And this is the first dimension of the soul, the thinking function, not the whole soul, but essential dimension, part of the quaternity that Jesus knew must be developed for wholeness. And when you see this, when you recognize that Jesus was not just teaching religious doctrine, but modeling psychological integration, everything changes. His parables are not just stories, they are thinking function exercises. His debates with Pharisees are not just arguments. They are demonstrations of thinking integrated with other functions. His entire teaching ministry is map for developing the first dimension of the quaternity, the thinking function that every soul requires to be whole. The second dimension of the quaternity that Jesus demonstrated is the feeling function, and this is where Jesus becomes most recognizable to religious consciousness. His compassion, his love, his capacity to feel with and for others. He wept with those who mourned. He felt compassion for crowds. He responded emotionally to suffering, to injustice, to need. This is the feeling function fully developed, and it is essential to wholeness. Many people reading Gospels see only this dimension, see Jesus only as loving, compassionate, emotionally present. And they try to imitate only this aspect. But Jesus was not just feeling. He integrated feeling with thinking, with sensation, with intuition. The feeling function was one dimension of his quaternity, not the entirety. And understanding this distinction is crucial for psychological development. I observed in my practice that feeling types, people who naturally live from emotion, believe their feeling capacity makes them whole. They pride themselves on emotional sensitivity, on empathy, on being able to feel what others feel. And these are genuine gifts. But when feeling function dominates without integration with thinking, it becomes problematic. These people are emotionally overwhelmed. They feel everything but understand nothing. They absorb others' emotions without boundaries. They mistake emotional intensity for depth. They believe that because they feel deeply, they are spiritually developed. But feeling without thinking is not wisdom. Feeling without sensation is not grounded. Feeling without intuition is not insightful. It is just one dimension operating alone. And Jesus demonstrated something different. He demonstrated feeling integrated with all other functions. He could feel compassion and think clearly about how to address need, could feel grief and remain present in his body, could feel love and access intuitive knowing of what the other person actually required. But I also observed many patients who had completely suppressed feeling function, particularly thinking types, particularly men in our culture who were taught that emotion is weakness. These people could think brilliantly, but could not feel, could analyze their life, but could not experience it, could understand depression intellectually, but could not access the grief beneath it. And working with them required developing what they had rejected, required teaching them that feeling is not weakness, that emotion is not irrationality, that the capacity to feel, really feel, not just think about feeling, is an essential dimension of the soul. And I would point them to Jesus, to the man who wept, who expressed anger, who felt compassion so deeply it moved him to action, who demonstrated that feeling function is not incompatible with wisdom, is not opposed to strength, is essential component of wholeness. Jesus used feeling function in service of healing. His compassion was not just emotion for its own sake. It was response to suffering that led to transformation. When he felt moved by someone's pain, he acted, he healed, he restored. He demonstrated that feeling function, when integrated with other dimensions, becomes powerful force for change. This is what many modern spiritual seekers miss. They cultivate feeling, they practice compassion, they work on opening their hearts, but they do not integrate it. They become overly sensitive, emotionally unstable, unable to think clearly when feelings arise, unable to remain grounded in their body when emotion overwhelms, unable to access intuitive guidance because feeling floods everything. This is not wholeness. This is one function dominating. And the symbol Jesus used, the quaternity, shows that feeling must be integrated with thinking, sensation, and intuition to create complete soul. When I taught patients to develop feeling function, I did not teach them to feel more intensely. I taught them to feel consciously, to notice emotion without being overwhelmed by it, to name feelings accurately, to understand what emotions were signaling, to use feeling as information rather than being possessed by it. This is what Jesus demonstrated. Conscious feeling, integrated feeling, feeling that served wholeness rather than fragmenting consciousness. And when patients achieved this integration, something profound shifted. They became more human, more present, more connected. Not because they felt more, but because they felt consciously, because feeling function was no longer suppressed or dominant. It was integrated. It was part of the quaternity. It was serving the wholeness of the self rather than trying to be the self. This is the second dimension of the soul. Essential but not sufficient, necessary but not complete. Part of the fourfold structure that Jesus knew every soul requires to be whole. The third dimension of the quaternity is the one most overlooked in religious interpretations of Jesus, the sensation function, the capacity to be fully present in the body, to engage physical reality, to be grounded in material existence. And Jesus demonstrated this dimension powerfully. He ate with people, he touched lepers, he walked dusty roads, he felt hunger, thirst, exhaustion. He healed bodies, not just souls. He fed crowds with physical food. He used physical objects in his teaching: seeds, coins, fish, bread. He was not a disembodied spirit. He was fully incarnate, fully present in physical reality. And this is the sensation function. The capacity to be here, in body, in material world, in present moment. And without this dimension, the soul is incomplete, is floating, is ungrounded, is disconnected from the reality in which it must actually live. I observed many patients who had suppressed sensation function completely. What I call intuitive types or thinking types, who live entirely in abstraction, in ideas, in possibilities, in future or past, but never here, never now, never in their body. These people could think brilliantly about life, but could not taste food, could feel deeply, but could not sense their own physical tension, could intuit profound truths, but could not feel their feet on ground. And they suffered from this disconnection, suffered from anxiety that comes from not being present, suffered from dissociation that comes from living in head while body is neglected, and the work with them was bringing consciousness into body, teaching them to sense, to feel physical sensations, to notice breath, tension, temperature, texture, to be here instead of always somewhere else. And I would point them to Jesus, to the man who was fully embodied, who did not transcend physical reality but engaged it, who demonstrated that spirituality is not escape from body but full presence in body. But I also worked with patients who were over-identified with sensation. Sensation types who lived only for physical experience, for pleasure, for comfort, for sensory stimulation. These people were present in body but disconnected from meaning. Could feel every sensation but could not think about what it meant, could be intensely present but lacked depth, lacked the thinking function that provides understanding, lacked the feeling function that provides value, lacked the intuitive function that perceives possibility. They were grounded but limited, present but superficial, and they needed what Jesus demonstrated: sensation integrated with other functions, the capacity to be physically present and intellectually engaged, to sense fully and feel deeply, to be grounded in body and open to intuition. This is integration. This is what the quaternity requires, not rejecting sensation, not over-identifying with it, but integrating it as essential dimension of wholeness. Jesus used sensation function in his healing ministry. He touched people, physical touch, not just energetic, not just spiritual, actual physical contact. He made mud and placed it on eyes. He broke bread with his hands. He allowed his body to be touched by the woman with the hemorrhage. He washed feet. He demonstrated that physical engagement is not opposed to spiritual development, is essential to it. The incarnation itself, the theological doctrine that God became flesh, is profound psychological truth. It means spirit cannot become whole without engaging matter, cannot achieve completeness without physical embodiment, cannot fulfill itself without sensation function. And this is what many spiritual seekers miss. They try to transcend body, try to overcome physical reality, try to escape sensation through meditation, through asceticism, through spiritual practices that deny flesh. And they become ungrounded, become dissociated, become unable to function in the world they claim to be serving. This is not wholeness. This is rejection of one dimension of the quaternity. And until sensation is integrated, the soul remains incomplete. When I taught patients to develop sensation function, I taught them to sense their body, to notice where they feel tension, to breathe consciously, to taste food mindfully, to feel textures, to be present in physical experience without judgment. And as they developed this capacity, they became more grounded, less anxious, more capable of staying present when emotion arose or thinking became overwhelming. The sensation function provided anchor, provided connection to present moment, provided grounding that thinking alone cannot provide, that feeling alone cannot sustain, that intuition alone cannot stabilize. This is the third dimension of the soul, the one Jesus demonstrated through full embodiment, through physical presence, through engagement with material reality as sacred rather than profane, through showing that the symbol of four includes body, not just mind and spirit, includes sensation, not just thought and feeling, includes being here, now, in flesh, as essential dimension of what it means to be whole human soul. The fourth dimension of the quaternity is intuition. And this is where Jesus demonstrates what he called his connection to the Father. Intuition is not thinking, is not feeling, is not sensation. It is direct knowing that bypasses rational thought. It is perception of what is not immediately present. It is access to the unconscious, to the collective wisdom, to what I call the self. And Jesus possessed this function powerfully. He knew what people were thinking without being told. He perceived the inner state of those he encountered. He accessed wisdom that was not learned intellectually. He demonstrated what I call the intuitive function fully developed, And this is the fourth essential dimension of the soul. Without it, consciousness is limited to what can be thought, felt, or sensed. Without intuition, there is no access to the deeper dimensions of psyche, no connection to what Jesus called kingdom of heaven within, no capacity to perceive the archetypal realities that shape human experience. I observed that intuitive types, people who naturally live from this function, have profound gifts. They perceive patterns others miss. They sense what is coming before it arrives. They understand people deeply without needing explanation. They access creative insights spontaneously. But when intuition dominates without integration with other functions, it becomes problematic. These people live entirely in possibilities, in what could be, in future or past, but never present, never grounded. Never able to think clearly about their insights or feel deeply about their perceptions or remain in their body long enough to actualize what they intuit. They have profound visions but cannot manifest them, have deep insights but cannot communicate them, have access to unconscious wisdom but cannot integrate it into conscious life. This is not wholeness. This is one function operating alone. And Jesus demonstrated something different. He demonstrated intuition integrated with thinking, feeling, and sensation, could access profound wisdom and teach it clearly, could perceive inner states and respond with appropriate feeling, could receive intuitive guidance and remain grounded enough to follow it. But I also worked with many patients who had completely suppressed intuition. Sensation types and thinking types who trusted only what they could see, touch, measure, prove. These people were grounded but limited, could function well in material world but had no access to meaning beyond surface, no connection to the symbolic dimension of experience, no capacity to perceive the archetypes operating in their life, no sense of the numinous, and working with them required opening what they had closed, required teaching them that reality includes more than what is immediately apparent, that psyche includes unconscious dimensions. That intuition is not fantasy, but perception of what thinking, feeling, and sensation cannot access. And I would point them to Jesus, to the man who knew without being told, who perceived the kingdom of heaven that others could not see, who demonstrated that intuition is not opposed to rationality, is complementary to it, is essential dimension of complete consciousness. Jesus used intuition in his ministry constantly. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. He perceived when someone was ready for teaching and when they would reject it. He accessed wisdom that was not personal but archetypal. What he called receiving from the Father, I recognize as accessing the self, as connecting to the center of the psyche that contains wisdom beyond individual ego. This is what intuition provides. This is the fourth dimension of the soul, the capacity to perceive what is not obvious, to know what cannot be proven, to access guidance from depths that thinking cannot reach. And when this function is integrated with thinking, feeling, and sensation, it completes the quaternity, makes the soul whole, makes consciousness complete, makes the person capable of what Jesus called seeing the kingdom, perceiving the psychological and spiritual realities that most people miss because they are limited to 3 or fewer functions. When I taught patients to develop intuition, I taught them to work with dreams, to notice synchronicities, to pay attention to hunches, to trust insights that come without rational explanation, to engage in active imagination, to allow images to arise from unconscious and dialogue with them. And as they developed intuitive function, their consciousness expanded. They began perceiving dimensions of reality they had previously dismissed, began accessing guidance from depths, began understanding that the psyche includes more than conscious ego, that there are archetypal forces, collective wisdom, what Jung calls the self operating through intuition. This is the fourth dimension of the soul, the one Jesus demonstrated through his mystical connection to what he called Father, the one that completes the quaternity, the one that, when integrated with thinking, feeling, and sensation, creates whole human being, complete soul, individuated self, the symbol of four fulfilled. Now that I have shown you the four dimensions Jesus demonstrated, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, let me integrate what this symbol of the quaternity actually means psychologically. These are not separate parts to be developed sequentially. They are dimensions that must function together as unified whole. And this is what Jesus represented. This is what the symbol of the cross actually signifies. Not just suffering, but wholeness. The vertical axis representing thinking and feeling, the rational and emotional functions. The horizontal axis representing sensation and intuition, the grounded and transcendent functions. And where they intersect, at the center, is what I call the self. The complete, integrated consciousness, the whole soul. This is what Jesus called the kingdom. This is what I call individuation. And it requires all four dimensions functioning in harmony. Most people live fractionally. They develop one or two functions and suppress the others. And this creates the psychological suffering I observed in thousands of patients. The thinking type, who cannot access feeling, becomes cold, disconnected, unable to form genuine relationships. The feeling type, who cannot think, becomes emotionally unstable, unable to create frameworks for understanding experience. The sensation type, who cannot intuit, becomes trapped in materialism, unable to perceive meaning beyond physical reality. The intuitive type, who cannot ground in sensation, becomes dissociated, unable to function in practical reality. Every one-sided development creates specific suffering, creates incompleteness, creates the sense that something is missing, and what is missing is integration, is the development of all four dimensions, is the wholeness that the symbol of the quaternity represents. Jesus understood this. Whether consciously through study or unconsciously through archetypal wisdom, he structured his life and teaching around complete psychological wholeness. He thought clearly, he felt deeply, he remained present in body. He accessed intuitive wisdom. And these were not separate activities, they were integrated functions. He could teach intellectually and touch physically, could feel compassion and perceive intuitively what was needed, could remain grounded in sensation and access transcendent insight. This is integration. This is the quaternity functioning as unity. This is what every human soul is designed to become, but what few achieve because integration is difficult, requires developing what you have suppressed, requires using what feels unnatural, requires becoming complete instead of remaining comfortable in the partial consciousness of your dominant function. This is why I devoted my career to mapping the process of individuation, to showing that wholeness is achievable, to providing methods for developing suppressed functions, to teaching that the symbol Jesus used, the quaternity, the cross, the fourfold structure, is not just religious metaphor, is accurate psychological map, shows what completeness requires, shows which dimensions must be integrated, shows why partial development creates suffering and complete development creates what Jesus called abundant life. Most religious teaching misses this, focuses on belief rather than development, on worship rather than integration, on accepting Jesus as Savior rather than following Jesus as model for psychological wholeness. But when you see the symbol, when you understand the quaternity, everything changes. Jesus is not just someone to worship, he is pattern to actualize, template for complete human development, demonstration of what soul can become when all four dimensions are integrated. And here is what concerns me. Modern spirituality Even much of analytical psychology focuses on developing specific functions without emphasizing integration. People practice meditation to develop intuition but neglect thinking. Practice compassion to develop feeling but suppress sensation. Practice mindfulness to develop sensation but avoid thinking. And they wonder why they remain incomplete, why something is missing, why their spiritual development feels unbalanced. It is because they are developing one dimension while neglecting others, are moving toward one quadrant of the quaternity instead of toward the center where all four integrate. The symbol Jesus used shows that wholeness requires all four. Not one, not two, not three. All four. Thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition, consciousness and unconsciousness, ego and self, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, all integrated, all functioning together, all serving the wholeness of the soul that the quaternity symbolizes and that Jesus embodied. So now you understand the symbol Jesus used to describe the human soul, the quaternity, the fourfold structure requiring thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, all integrated into wholeness. But understanding is not transformation. Practice is required. The practice of developing your suppressed functions, of integrating what you have rejected, of moving from fractional consciousness toward complete consciousness. Let me share the practices I developed for this work. The practices that allow you to actualize what Jesus demonstrated, to become whole soul instead of remaining partial consciousness. The first practice is identifying your dominant function. This requires honest self-observation. Notice how you naturally operate when making decisions. Do you think logically, thinking dominant? Do you consider how you and others will feel, feeling dominant? Do you focus on practical details and immediate reality? Sensation dominant. Do you perceive possibilities and future implications? Intuition dominant. Your dominant function is what comes naturally, what you trust, what feels most like you. And once you identify it, you know where you are strong, but you also know, by implication, what you have suppressed. Because the function opposite your dominant is typically your inferior function. If thinking dominates, feeling is suppressed. If sensation dominates, intuition is suppressed, and vice versa. This is the work. Developing the inferior function. Integrating what Jesus demonstrated, but what you have rejected. The second practice is working with your inferior function consciously. If feeling is inferior, practice making decisions based on values and emotional impact rather than logic alone. Notice how things make you feel. Name emotions accurately. Allow yourself to value feeling as valid information. If thinking is inferior, practice analyzing your experience. Create frameworks for understanding what happens. Read psychology. Reflect on patterns. Develop capacity to think about life instead of just experiencing it. If intuition is inferior, practice working with dreams. Notice synchronicities, trust hunches, engage imagination. Allow yourself to perceive beyond immediate sensory reality. If sensation is inferior, practice being present in body. Notice physical sensations. Taste food mindfully, feel textures, ground yourself in present moment reality. This work is uncomfortable. Inferior function feels awkward, unreliable, foreign, but development requires using what you have suppressed, requires becoming comfortable with discomfort, requires expanding consciousness to include all four dimensions instead of remaining limited to one or two. The third practice is what I call holding the tension of opposites. This is essential for integration. You must learn to use dominant and inferior functions simultaneously, to think and feel at the same time, to be grounded in sensation while accessing intuition, to be rationally clear and emotionally present. Most people collapse into one function when stressed, default to what feels natural, but wholeness requires holding both, requires what feels like contradiction, requires being both rational and emotional, both present and transcendent, both grounded and visionary. Jesus demonstrated this constantly. He could think clearly about theological questions and feel deeply about human suffering, could be present to physical needs and perceive spiritual realities, could teach rationally and heal through touch, could be grounded in body and connected to what he called Father. This is integration. This is the quaternity functioning as unity. And practicing this, consciously using all four functions, is how you move from fractional to complete consciousness. The fourth practice is active imagination with the symbol itself. I taught patients to visualize the quaternity, to imagine a cross or mandala with four quadrants, to place their dominant function in one quadrant and consciously explore the others, to dialogue with personifications of their inferior function, to ask, "What do you need from me? What gift do you bring? What would life be like if I integrated you instead of suppressing you?" And through sustained practice of this inner work, patients developed relationship with their inferior function, began accessing what had been inaccessible, began integrating what had been rejected, and their consciousness expanded, became more complete, more whole, more like what Jesus demonstrated and what the symbol of the quaternity represents. These practices are not quick fixes. Integration takes years, sometimes decades, but progress is observable. As you develop inferior function, you become more balanced, more capable, more present to full range of human experience. You can think and feel, can be grounded and visionary, can function in practical reality and perceive symbolic meaning. This is what Jesus demonstrated. This is what the quaternity symbolizes. This is what your soul can become if you do the work of making unconscious conscious, of integrating rejected functions, of becoming whole instead of remaining partial. The symbol Jesus used shows the goal. These practices show the path, and your willingness to walk that path determines whether you remain fractional or become complete. We have walked through something today that most religious teaching overlooks. The symbol Jesus used to describe the human soul. Not a simple image, not a vague metaphor, but precise psychological map showing that soul is structured in four dimensions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, and that wholeness requires integrating all four. I spent my career observing this structure in clinical practice, seeing that patients who suffered were living fractionally, using one or two functions while suppressing others, and seeing that healing came through integration, through developing what had been rejected, through becoming complete instead of remaining partial. And when I studied Jesus psychologically, I recognized that he was demonstrating the same wholeness, was embodying the quaternity, was showing what complete human soul actually looks like when all four dimensions function as integrated unity. This changes everything about spiritual development. Most religious teaching focuses on belief, on accepting correct doctrines, on worshipping properly. But Jesus was not primarily teaching what to believe. He was demonstrating how to become whole, how to integrate thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition into complete consciousness, how to be fully human, fully alive, fully present to all dimensions of experience. This is what he meant by abundant life, by the kingdom within, not heavenly reward after death, but psychological wholeness available now. The complete, integrated soul that most people never achieve because they never understand that the symbol, the quaternity, the cross, the fourfold structure is map, not metaphor, is showing what must be developed, what must be integrated, what transformation actually requires. But I must be honest about what concerns me. Most people will not do this work, will prefer comfortable one-sidedness to difficult integration. will remain thinking types or feeling types, or sensation types or intuitive types, will develop their strengths and ignore their weaknesses, will live fractionally and wonder why they feel incomplete, why something is missing, why spiritual practices do not deliver the wholeness they promise. And the reason is simple. They are trying to achieve wholeness through partial development, are trying to reach the center of the quaternity by moving further into one quadrant, are trying to become complete by becoming more one-sided. This cannot work. The symbol shows clearly wholeness requires all four, requires moving toward center where thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition integrate, requires developing inferior function, requires becoming balanced instead of remaining dominant in one dimension. Which dimension did you recognize as yours? Are you thinking type trying to live entirely through rationality? Feeling type trying to navigate life through emotion alone? Sensation type trapped in materialism and immediate experience? Intuitive type lost in possibilities without grounding? And having recognized your type, will you do the work? Will you develop your inferior function? Will you integrate what you have suppressed? Will you move from fractional to complete consciousness? Or will you remain comfortable in your dominant function, missing the wholeness that Jesus demonstrated and that the symbol of the quaternity reveals is possible for every human soul? Share which function dominates for you. Your recognition begins the integration process, because consciousness of the problem is first step toward solution. Subscribe to continue this work of psychological and spiritual integration. 2 more videos appearing now. Choose one. Until we meet again, and from where I stand beyond time, we are always meeting in the eternal now. Remember this: Jesus used the symbol of 4 to describe the soul. Not because 4 is mystical number, but because 4 is psychologically accurate. Because soul is structured in 4 dimensions. Because wholeness requires thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition, all integrated into unified consciousness. This is not religious doctrine. This is psychological observation. This is what I saw in decades of clinical work. This is what Jesus demonstrated 2,000 years ago, and this is what remains available to anyone willing to do the work. The work of developing inferior function, of integrating suppressed dimensions, of moving from partial to complete consciousness. The symbol shows the goal. Your dominant function shows where you start. Your inferior function shows where you must go, and the work of integration is how you get there. Not through belief, through development, not through worship, through practice, not through accepting what Jesus did for you, through following what Jesus demonstrated you can do for yourself. Become whole. Integrate all 4 dimensions. Actualize the quaternity and discover that the kingdom Jesus spoke of is not distant heaven, is complete human consciousness, is psychological wholeness, is what your soul was always meant to become. The symbol has always been there, showing you what is possible, what is required, what transformation actually looks like. Now you know, and knowing you can choose, remain fractional or become whole. The symbol waits, the work waits, and your soul, structured in 4 dimensions, waits for you to finally become what Jesus demonstrated is possible: complete, integrated